Okay, all right. Okay, good. Okay. Resize windows. So, James, do I need this? Okay, fine. Thank you. Welcome, welcome. We are so happy you could join us this afternoon. We've had a pretty full day. We read from about 10 till 3 from the speeches. And one of the things we continually observed is no matter what he was talking about, uh, in speeches that really, many of which went back 50 years ago, they still retain their relevance, their resonance for today's times. In many cases, it doesn't please me to say that because he is often speaking in these speeches about the failures of the US government to attend to the urgent matters of civil rights and social justice, whether they concern police brutality or housing discrimination or employment discrimination or electoral politics, whatever he happened to train his eye on, there was typically a challenge to federal former or fellow activists, but primarily a challenge to those who hold power, those who dominate, those who oppress, and those who hoard wealth and opportunities while depriving others of the same. So we were both happy to be reading and not happy to be reading because we had a sense of how little things have changed. Let me just say, make a very few remarks about this project. We are online as opposed to being in hubs all around the University of Virginia and the city of Charlottesville, which we have been doing since 2018 when we launched this project. And we launched it, actually, it could seem to some macabre, when for Julian's death on August 15th. And we thought, well, nobody celebrates a death, and we're not celebrating a death, but we're celebrating the continual vitality of Julian Bond's legacy by keeping his writings and his work alive, or keeping his writing and his commitments alive and sharing them with the public. It was especially important to us to be launching the crowdsource event in 2018 because that was in the aftermath, in fact, close on the year's anniversary of August 11th, 12th, when the alt-right marched on Charlottesville. So we weren't so much attempting to usurp or displace that anniversary, but to place alongside it something that really was about moving forward and about reminding us of the nature of struggle. And Julian's life and career does nothing if not remind us of the nature of struggle. We held the Transcribe-a-thon in these various public sites because we are, that is the Carter G. Woodson Institute and the Center for Digital Editing, engaged in a collaborative project called the Julian Bond Papers Project. And so what we are doing with that project, which has centered thus far, or in the public domain, on transcription, is we have sought to involve the public in advancing the ongoing work of what will become a scholarly edition of Julian Bond's papers. Those papers are housed in the University of Virginia's Special Collections Library, where Julian Bond donated them in 2005. Now, I can't imagine anyone in our audience does not know who Julian Bond was, but just in case there is some soul who doesn't, I'll just give you a thumbnail view. He was a leader in American civil rights from his college years as a key contributor and co-founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. He served in the Georgia legislature, led the NAACP and the Southern Poverty Law Center, taught at American University, Harvard University, and the University of Virginia, retaining a significant voice in American politics and culture for 5 decades. Bond's papers reflect legislative, activist, organizer, and personal perspectives on the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the Nixon-Reagan administrations and Carter, voting rights, equal education, race and class, fair housing, healthcare access, LGBTQI rights, and the environmental movement. Let me just say one brief thing about Bond's time at Virginia, because it's altogether fitting that we are advancing this project at the University of Virginia, where Julian Bond taught for 20 years, from 1992 to 2012, in the Corcoran Department of History. By conservative estimates, over 5,000 students enrolled in his blockbuster course on the history of the civil rights movement. And as one student put it who took that course, in these classes, he made his past our present. Indeed, making his past our present has been reinforced throughout our work, especially most recently on the speeches. And so it is in connection with that project and in connection with the focus on the speeches that we come to you today. We have the good fortune of having Julian Bond's son, Councilman Michael Julian Bond, with us from Atlanta, and he's going to make a few remarks before we begin the panel discussion proper. Michael, take it away.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you for the very kind introduction. And I'd like to, on behalf of my family, thank UVA and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for putting this on. It is, very appreciated by the Bonds, not just here in Atlanta, but all across the country, who loved my father dearly. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm looking forward to the debate. In our own lives, my siblings and myself have tried to uphold the legacy of my father, and thus that's why I'm in public service at this very moment. He was an inspiration to me personally to pursue an elected path. My siblings were a little wiser than I was and did not do it. In their own lives and in their own vocations. But my earliest memories following my father around in his elected capacity, I learned activism. I learned community service. I learned looking out for those of us of a different hue in America. And I often sat literally at his footsteps as he typed with these two fingers to bat out those speeches that you also eloquently recited today. And so I'm just very, very appreciative of being here. I love the trips that I made to UVA to watch him teach. And so this is a good experience for me. And I'm interested in hearing the perspectives on his life through others' eyes. And so with that, let's begin the discussion. And thank you for allowing me to greet you today.
No, it is our honor and our pleasure to have you. Your sister Phyllis is still with us. She read, as I indicated earlier, and she's still here in the group this afternoon. So we want to acknowledge for the rest of you that Councilman Bond's sister Phyllis is also with us. And so the Bond family is very well represented. And Julian Bond's widow, Pam Horowitz, had intended to be here, but got waylaid on a trip. As she wrote to me, I'm in a car with people and I'm not driving. So she is not with us. I'm certain she's here with us in spirit. So we're going to have a pretty informal discussion. I will briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they will appear. Let me explain something about the logic of the panel. As we mentioned, Julian began his career as a social activist as a very young person, as a college student, and he remained invested in youth throughout his career. In fact, I was reading recently an interview he was doing with Philip Agnew. Tasha, remind me of the organization that Philip Agnew founded, because it just evaporated from my head. Was it
Dream
the youth?
Defenders.
The dream, I was going to say the Youth Defenders. I remember Defenders, the Dream Defenders. So Julian was sitting with them near the very end of his life, understanding how important youth are to social transformation. And so we couldn't imagine a panel focused on the life and writings of Julian Bond that did not include youth. And so we're going to have, not that you are age either, I'm the only person who can claim age in this gathering, but you and Jeannie Theoharis and Latasha Levy will represent the previous generation, and Ziana Bryant and Rebecca Barber will represent youth. These are two very, very active women. I asked Rebecca's permission to share with the audience that she is a chip off the old block, and she allowed me to say that her father is none other than Reverend Barber, who holds us, the founder of Moral Mondays, who has carried on the Poor People's Movement, and so much more than that. I could spend the rest of the hour talking about Reverend Barber, but Rebecca is his daughter. And she happened to share that she thought her dad, the day she thought her dad was cool, was the day she saw him walk up to Julian Bond and have a conversation. And I said to her, well, many of us knew your father was cool without knowing that he walked up to Julian Bond. So without further ado, brief introductions of our panelists. Latasha Levy will start us off. She is an assistant professor of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, where she teaches courses on African American history and culture. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Northwestern University and was awarded, I'm proud to say, a postdoctoral fellowship at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for her research on Black Republican politics during the height and decline of the Black Freedom Movement, which book is forthcoming. She is a contributing author of the recent civil rights text, Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, edited by Hassan Jeffries. In 2015, Dr. Levy served as the academic liaison for the Civil Rights South seminar that Julian Bond led and designed for 10 years. Indeed, this was the last tour Julian went on. Later that summer, he passed away. That same year, Dr. Levy taught one of the first college courses on Black Lives Matter right here at UVA, and has since expanded resources for educators to understand and teach recent movements in historical contexts. Our next speaker is Jeannie Theoharis, who is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. Her research focuses broadly on the civil rights and Black power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare and civil rights in post 9/11 America. She is the author of numerous books and articles, including A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, the award-winning The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, and co-author with Pamela Horowitz of the forthcoming Julian Bond's Time to Teach, A History of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And Jeannie was kind enough to send me the page proofs the other week. I'm really looking forward to this book. Yesterday, on the anniversary of the Watts Uprising, she published an article in the Washington Post, which I highly recommend to you, about understanding today's uprisings, which will require understanding what came before them. Again, this editorial was in the Washington Post yesterday. Then in the youth section, Rebecca will lead us. Rebecca participated in our 2016 Julian Bond Memorial Symposium. Then she was a college student at North Carolina Central, from which she has since graduated with degrees in English and history. After college, she worked as a research associate at the Institute for Southern Studies in Durham, North Carolina. Her research focuses largely on racial justice, democracy, and Southern history. This research experience, as well as Rebecca's work with groups such as the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, motivated her to pursue a degree in public policy. She is currently a student at Duke University, pursuing her master's in that field, with particular interests in the intersection between poverty and race. You are your father's daughter. Finally, Ziana Bryant is entering her second year at the University of Virginia. She is known in these parts, this is our homegrown child, for her fierce and uncompromising commitment to improving the lives of Black people. And she takes action to enact the changes she wants to see, as was noted in a profile on her on the Teaching Tolerance website. Ziana organized her first protest, a response to the Trayvon Martin verdict, when she was only 12 years old. You heard me right, 12 years old. And at 15, she petitioned the city of Charlottesville to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee from what was formerly called Lee Park here in Charlottesville, a move that, not surprisingly, aggravated virulent white supremacists. Ziana's push to have the statue removed from Charlottesville began as a high school assignment in which she was tasked with describing something she could change. She later reformatted it into a change.org petition to rally support around the history. And that petition garnered hundreds of signatures. And the rest, as we say, is history. That history is working its way, but we know that Ziana got this city started with this petition to remove the Robert E. Lee statue. She's been a member of the Charlottesville's Youth Council. She founded the Black Student Union at her high school, was a student representative to the school board for Charlottesville City Schools, and has racked up prestigious awards that not all of which I can name here. I'll mention only the 2018 Yale Bassett Award for Community Engagement. She is also the author of Reclaim, a collection of poetry and essays. So welcome all of you to our panel, and I will turn everything over now to the panel, starting with Latasha Levy.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank you, Professor McDowell, for pulling this thing together and for inviting us to be here and for all the things you've done over the past several years to make sure that we honor and uplift Julian Bond's memory and his legacy. I was one of the lucky students out of the 5,000 to take his blockbuster course as an undergraduate student at UVA. And it wasn't until he passed away that I was really angry about that experience, because he spent so much time talking about what everyone else did, particularly women. And so it wasn't until I actually went into the archives to look at the Julian Bond papers, and after thinking that I knew this man on a, I wasn't like one of his closest students, but I've had several engagements with him and talked to him one-on-one. And I was in the Julian Bond papers and felt like, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea just how deep and thorough and even the word loving comes to mind as far as his political thought. And I mean, are familiar with the speeches and everything, but I was really blown away about what I discovered in the archive, because in class, he didn't put the spotlight on himself at all, And so I did, had the blessing to work with him more directly on the Civil Rights South seminar in that, the 10th year. And so I was determined to make sure that I focused some parts of that seminar on his particular contribution. So it is hard to talk about yourself, but my goodness, he was just so amazing. And it was the 50th anniversary of his 1965 campaign too in Georgia. And so he didn't talk about it, but I brought that aspect to it, to the Civil Rights South seminar, and just feel so blessed to have had that opportunity to bring students there. And also thank you, Dr. McDowell, for pulling it off so that students could participate and that there was a youth presence there, because it really did change the dynamic of the seminar. One aspect of Julian Bond's legacy that it's always with me is that he modeled through that campaign a literal power to the people before it was the most popular slogan. So in 1965, he set out to be the people's candidate, and he sought to bring the people's visions to the halls of power. So, I think about that campaign in terms of power to all the people by representing their interests and not the interests of the rich and the powerful or the corporate interests, And he emphasized that ordinary people don't need you as a politician to represent their interests. They need politicians to represent their visions. So even in the way they framed the campaign, it was around this understanding that ordinary people understand the problems that they have, and they have solutions to those problems that they face every day. And I think that was quite remarkable. And it was reflective of the principles and ideology of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to trust Indigenous leadership, to cultivate local leadership, to empower people to solve their own problems. And he used his education and privilege to really defer to the vision of the people. Secondly, I wanted to make the point that Julian Bond also forces us to think more critically about representation, because we're still falling into the trap of tokenism, empty symbolism, sort of a perversion of identity politics that overemphasizes identity and no politics, or identity at the expense of politics. And so as the people's representative, Bond did not dictate to the people. He actually built his campaign on the notion that these people should write the platform. The people should write his platform. He felt it necessary to go into to the churches and to go into people's homes. And as he said, to go into the pool halls, wherever Black people were, and generate ideas and strategies around identifying problems, solutions, and policies, and not just for a photo op, so much of what we see today. And that kind of engagement, that level of interaction and respect and trust in ordinary people is rare in the US political system. And for that reason, we see that people are disenchanted, detached, disconnected, and fed up. But if we take up Bond's ideas around representation and what he modeled for us, it really does open up possibilities for transformation. And so in this moment, I feel like we're afraid, and it's important to revisit his legacy and the fact that he always stood up to be, critical and to hold our leaders accountable. So too many of us, even in this recent context, are demanding silence and compliance from Black people. So genuine representation seems unrealistic or unattainable at sometimes. But the good news is on local and state politics, we've seen some major upsets where progressive candidates have been posing these formidable challenges and are trying to these different strategies to represent ordinary people and not elites and corporate interests, the wealthy and powerful. And in that way, I think we're seeing waves of change that should inspire us. And I think, I would imagine that Julian Bond, today would be right along champion that. The other issue that comes up for me in thinking about Julian Bond's legacy is that, you know, so much of what we might hear in this moment is anybody but Trump, you know, and so it doesn't matter what the Democrats bring to us. And what I keep thinking about as far as Julian Bond's legacy is concerned is this connection that he always made between politics and protest, you know, that you can't minimize or, you know, ask for silence and compliance, that we always need to be organizing and that we always need to be held, you know, to organize to hold our elected officials accountable. And so I want to I think this is a great opportunity to, you know, to focus on his legacy and those lessons that he teaches us, because it's not about going from protest to politics. You always need protests in your politics. And so I think that's something that he definitely has taught us. And so this isn't a matter of, well, you just need to vote because people died for you, as we often hear, people died for your right to vote. People, you know, like Julian Bond, sacrificed so much so that people can run for political office. You know, it's not just about being able to vote between, you know, these sorry candidates. It's about who's running, who are we running for office? You know, who are we supporting in terms of campaigns? And so I think that, you know, he had a certain kind of wisdom that would suggest that, yeah, absolutely, we need to vote out the cancer that's in the White House right now, but not at the expense of organizing protests and always speaking truth to power, however that looks, whoever are in those roles, you know? And the other thing that I was kind of thinking about right now is Julian Bond's critiques of this rancid two-party system, you know? And so he had a very strong critique of the two-party system, and also talked about independent political party or third party politics. And, you know, he was talking about this during a time when many Black folks were identifying as independents. And there was a possibility for an actual third party movement, you know, in the 70s. But I suspect that Mr. Bond would emphasize, if ever there was a need to break the cancer of the two-party system, it is now. And that's not going to fall from the sky. It's something that we have to build and fight and organize for. You did mention, McDowell, that, you know, he was standing with Dream Defenders, and that's a moment that pulls at my heartstrings, because I did start to teach about Black Lives Matter in the middle of, you know, as the movement was mobilizing, and it was just such a warm and inspiring visual to see him down there, not at the podium, you know, saying very few words, but he was listening. And I can imagine that he, you know, thought of himself that he was probably around, well, maybe younger than Philip Agnew, or they were, you know, that he was around the same age as these young people who were keeping the fight going, you know. And so that was incredible that he joined them down there. And if you look at the timeline of Black Lives Matter, if you start with the slogan, then Dream Defenders gets written out of that history. But those young people in Florida had to organize in order to even get George Zimmerman arrested. You know, and so they were registering people to vote. They were fighting against stand your ground laws. They were fighting school to prison pipeline. And so I think that was a really critical moment and a beautiful moment to see the connection that they were making intergenerationally, and, you know, meeting with people like Julian Bond. I think, I can't think of his name right now. The activist, Hollywood.
Danny Glover?
Oh, anyway,
not
Danny Glover.
Because he was with Danny Glover in the environmental, one of his last arrests was for organizing against the Keystone Pipeline. And he was with Danny Glover.
Who's the Dayo singer? The Dayo singer.
Oh, Belafonte.
Belafonte. See, Julian Bond would be so disappointed. He would be so disappointed in me right now. And then lastly, I just wanted to think about a couple of things that I loved about Julian Bond. One was that he had a funny sense of humor, which sounds crazy, but it was like a lot of times, it's like, I can't even tell you stories because it's kind of inappropriate. And not in like a dirty joke or sexist joke, but just laughing at things that you probably shouldn't be laughing at, or not knowing if he's joking or not. And so he could have really been a stand-up comedian. There was
He could
one,
have.
and maybe he would have bombed, but I think that was part of it in him. Like maybe he wanted to be like a Richard Pryor in some other life. I don't know. But he was so funny. And it was almost just around irony, like, you know, just pointing out the irony of things and laughing about it. But there was one moment at the Civil Rights South seminar where, again, I'm trying to highlight his contributions. And I say, well, Julian Bond is a poet also. He's a poet.
Yeah.
And so I want him to share one of his favorite poems that he's written for us. And so he sits there and he says, my favorite poem that I've written it goes like this. Look at that girl, shake that thing. We all can't be Martin Luther King. And then that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Just those two lines. He didn't share anything else. But even those two lines, we can dissect that a bit. Look at that girl, shake that thing. We all can't be Martin Luther King, you know? And so even the stories he has around that, being a college student and writing that poem, because white people would say to him, oh, I wish the others were like you, you know, in terms of breaking down respectability and so on. And the last thing I loved about him, not only did he was humorous, but he also loved music. And and so he just reminded me of ways that we bring joy into our struggles, you know. And so he wasn't always so serious, and you know, at every moment and every interaction that I had with him, I would laugh. And I can always see how music really lifted his spirits and how that might have also helped him going as well. And so I'll stop there because of time. Sorry if I went too long.
No, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Jeannie?
Good afternoon. It is a huge honor to be here and to be together lifting up Julian today. So like Professor Levy, I too had the great good fortune of getting to be in Professor Bond's class when I was a junior, and then actually 2 years later getting to be his teaching assistant. And I had this indelible memory. So I'm my 20-year-old self, and I'm like so excited because I'm kind of a student activist. And so I'm getting to take a class with Julian Bond and the Civil Rights Movement. And he spends 3 days on the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm like, what on earth is this? This is taking too long. And he's telling me who's calling who and what happened at 2 o'clock and what happened at 4 o'clock. And when I think back on that, like what that did in terms of how, so one of his hugest pet peeves, right, was as he called it, the master narrative of the civil rights movement. And he had a funny way of putting it. He would say, the master narrative is Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and the white folks saw the light and saved the day, right? So it's like a 1, 2, 3, and like obviously with white people being the saviors. And one of the things, right, that 3 days on the Montgomery bus boycott completely changed for us was this doesn't just happen. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's about a whole bunch of different people doing a whole bunch of different things. And this indelibly kind of changed and shaped both how I would think about my own activism, how I would think about the civil rights movement, and obviously now how I write and teach about it, and also teach about the misuses and the kind of mishistory of it, because he was very clear about the ways that the civil rights movement was being misused, right? That it just happened, that good, decent people saw the light, that they were on the right side, that there were some bad Southern racists, but the good, decent people, and he really took exception with that. And I think did so for a couple of reasons. I think the first was to kind of challenge this kind of American exceptionalism that sits at the heart of the master narrative, right? And that America's just getting like better and better and better. But the second was that part of what the master narrative did was it made it hard to see how we could do it ourselves, right? That it kind of obscured the process. And in many ways, part of the genius of how he taught, and like Professor McDowell was saying, I'm really excited. So the book we're coming out with in January is his teaching lectures, like sewn together into a narrative of the civil rights movement. So we hope it's going to be like taking a class with Julian. And And so I think part of, at base of why he loved teaching was not because he was going to tell us what to do, but because telling that history made it possible to see how we could do it again. And so I thought I would share like 5 things I learned from him. The first was, I think there's this way that we tend to celebrate the civil rights movement, like you shine a light on injustice. And literally President Bush says this when he proposes the legislation to put a statue of Rosa Parks in. You just shine a light on injustice, and injustice is changed. And Julian was very clear, no. You have to shine a light over and over and over, and you got to get in their faces, and they're gonna not like it, right? And so this sense that like you just come and you expose an injustice and you reveal it for what it is, and that's how change happens. He was very clear that that is a way that the United States now likes to sort of portray the civil rights movement, but it bears very little resemblance to what actually happened, right? And so he was very clear about how many years and decades people had been struggling, how much sacrifice, right? And he was very clear that we tend to focus on the violence and not on the economic violence, right? Not on the other forms of trauma. The second, and I think this might be the most important, was he was clear that you will be afraid, right? Over and over, he was clear both about his own participation and everyone else's, that it's not this moment where you just get past fear, right? You don't like the clouds don't part, that you have to act through fear, with fear. And I think for many of us, both older people and younger people, right, that this is a lesson that really, to me, in this moment, right, is so important, because I think sometimes, and particularly for the older people here, for the administrators, for the senior faculty, right, that like you don't have the luxury of not working through your fears, not working through the things that you can lose, right? And he was very clear about that. Third, and I think related to that, was he told so many stories, right, about kind of how people were moved to action. But embedded in those stories is that there is no divine sign. And one of my favorite stories was the story he would tell about E.D. Nixon, right, who's one of the organizers in Montgomery, calling Dr. King the morning after Rosa Parks is arrested because the Women's Political Council has decided to call a boycott on Monday. And he wakes King up, and it's like 6 a.m, and Dr. King is 26. He has a brand new baby, 3-week-old baby, Yolanda. And he wakes King up, right? And so Julian's telling the story, and Nixon's like, I want to use your church for a meeting. And King says, can you call me back? And just like all of us would, right? When people call with a scheme at 6 a.m, you're like, I need to think about it. And I think what he did over and over in the many stories he told about people was show us that Dr. King didn't know he was like Dr. Martin Luther King in neon, right? This is the moment the lightning, the clouds part, right? He had to make a choice, and he had to make another choice. He had to make another choice. And I think part of what that showed us, right, was that you are going to have to move without a sign, right? That it's only well after the fact that this is a history shaping moment, right? That you have to do things over and over and over and over. Fourth, he was very clear that young people lead. And he was also very clear that you can't expect most adults to like it, right? And so one of the things I feel like he really impressed on us was there will be some adult mentors who will sort of go the full distance with you and sit with you and be Ella Baker or be, the many older people in Mississippi that sheltered them. But there will be many, many adults, school administrators, your parents, other people in the community who will say you're moving too fast, you're being too reckless, you're being too loud, you're being too rude. And I think particularly in this moment, this is a very important kind of lesson, because I think we've really sanitized that out of the way we think about the civil rights movement. And so again, we imagine, kind of communities rallying behind these young activists when the support was not as unanimous and uniform, right? And that again, he was like, history will catch up. People will catch up. You lead, but and people will catch up. And I think the final lesson, and again, I think this speaks very much to today and the ways that the civil rights movement, again, is often misused, is the importance and necessity of disruption, right? So he was very much, again, challenging this idea that, like, if you just show people injustice, that's how that then things will just change. And he was very clear that kind of the genius of SNCC, the genius of Dr. King, was the willingness to be disruptive, and to be disruptive over and over and over, and to make people uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the grossest misuses, particularly of Dr. King, is now that he gets rolled out, right, over and over and over, and we saw this even a few weeks ago, right, to chastise current protests. Why aren't you being more like Martin Luther King? And I think what Julian would say to us is that they are, and they've picked up this torch. And I just think he would be, sometimes I just wish he was here, because he would just be so delighted with what we've been seeing over the past many years, but in particular over the past many months. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I love this idea of disruption, and that you pointed out that Dr. King understood the importance of disruption. I'm not the first person to note that of all the things King wrote, of all the speeches he delivered, the one, of course, that many people want to trot out is "I Have a Dream." But what they don't want to trot out in that speech is the sheer repetition. If you read that speech over and over and over again, he is saying, we are not satisfied. We are not satisfied. And you would never know that that language was in that speech, because we get these 30 words about my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. I mean, that King is made to mollify. King is made to seem what he was not, because in that speech, again and again, we are not satisfied. All right, we're going to turn to Rebecca and then Ziana. And I hope we may run just slightly over, because we want the audience to have a chance to ask a few questions. All right, Rebecca.
Thank you, Professor McDowell, for this opportunity. I didn't have a personal relationship with Mr. Bond, but like Professor McDowell was saying earlier, the first time I kind of saw him in person I was tagging along with my dad, actually, when Mr. Bond was chairman of the NAACP and my dad was on the national board. And one thing that I picked up pretty easily was that he, as well as my dad at the time, were LGBT affirming when a lot of people weren't. Mm-hmm. So that just showed me that he was very engaged and understood how so many issues intersect. And I know Professor Levy, you said earlier about how he uplifted women a lot in your classes. And for a Black woman in particular, that's important to me. But one of my favorite stories from him that I did hear him tell in person, and I am paraphrasing, but it's the story of 2 men who they see these babies in the river, and they're wondering how did they get here, and one man tries to pick them up, rescue them one by one, and then another he goes, and the other man asks, where are you going? He said he's going to find out who's throwing these babies in the river. And for me, what this is saying is, we have to get to the root cause of the problem. I'm a student in public policy now, and for me, it's telling me, if we want to address certain issues, we have to address the policies that cement discrimination, into the law. And I'm just gonna look at my notes for a little bit. And as I was reading over some of the readings, what I was reminded by was how relevant many of the speeches still are. I'm thankful that we do have them documented so we can look back, but increasingly see the relevancy. Particularly for me, when he was talking about racism, poverty, and fascism, he was a man informed by history, but also in some ways, a man of his time. because he speaks in a way that's still relevant today. And one thing in particularly that intrigued me was when he talked about how at the time, the country was funneling billions of dollars into the Pentagon, while many across the country were struggling to survive. You know, the same is true for today. When it comes to education, we ask, how do we fund it? When it comes to healthcare for all, we ask if that is an unachievable dream. And when it comes to providing social programs for the poor, we act like it can't be done and we can't find the resources. But as the Poor People's Campaign found in a recent report, simply by defunding the Pentagon, we can provide for an abundance of social programs. You know, and I think that's what he was getting at. You know, we have the resources. You know, like I said, you know, in some of my classes, we talk about this idea, this concept of scarcity. But in the movement, we know that scarcity is a lie and it's an excuse. When it comes to military spending, America has the money for it. When it comes to bailing out billionaires, we find the money for it. But where are the resources for the most marginalized? And I liked how he put it in one of his speeches because it was just so visually, you know, it just made so much sense. He said, we spend more money on pet food than on food stamps. And, you know, I was just thinking about that because in this country and even globally, there are some people who are treated as though they are disposable. There are people who are literally treated with less care than animals. And that's a problem. And, you know, I appreciate that, you know, he was drawing attention to it then. You know, I'm sad that it's still the case now. You know, and he talked about how in this country we have capitalism for the rich and socialism for the poor. And I just think that's so true because, you know, right now in this pandemic, it's largely Black and brown, low-wage workers who are keeping this country running. But many of them don't even have a livable wage. And we call them essential, but we treat them as though they're disposable. The country treats them that way. So, you know, I'm just reminded by that and reminded of how, you know, Mr. Bond taught us not to just think in terms of what's happening in America, but related to what's happening in other countries, because oftentimes we do see trends. You know, and I'm just reminded, you know, how so many of the battles that we're fighting, you know, from racism and poverty, they're just so deeply entrenched. And you know, it's a battle for power. And it's a battle that, you know, people like Julian Bond fought before us. And like him, we might not see the battle won in our lifetimes, but we still have to fight, particularly in this moment. You know, so once again, you know, I just continue to be reminded of why, you know, we have to find out who's throwing the babies in the river to begin with and address the root causes.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to amend something you said that Julian spoke about capitalism for the rich and socialism for the poor. It was the reverse. It was socialism for the rich.
Yeah,
and
sorry about
capitalism,
that.
Yeah, and capitalism for the poor. And we are not accustomed to, but we have capitalism for corporations for sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Our last speaker.
Correcting me.
No, that's all right. I mean, it's easy enough, but the extent to which there is this tendency to use socialism as a truncheon with which to beat people, right? And if you want to provide a social safety net, you want to create socialism. No, we already have socialism. It's just for the corporate and moneyed classes. It's not for the poor. All right, Ziana Bryant is our last speaker. Ziana, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor McDowell, so much for this opportunity. I have had the privilege of learning from you, Professor McDowell, for a couple of years, and every conversation is great. So I actually pulled some of the same quotes that Rebecca pulled, and specifically the quote about capitalism and socialism. And so I think for me, while reading about Julian Bond's work for the past couple of weeks, we just formed the Black Youth Action Committee here in Charlottesville. And so we've been pulling some readings from Julian Bond to help us figure out that work and how we're going to structure that committee. And I've really been thinking a lot about scholarship and activism and how we should be bridging that gap between the ivory tower and people who are in the community. And so I think while being a student at UVA, it's really helped me to see that gap and to see how even right now in this 2020 uprising, the default is to create another book club. The default is to get another common read. And so what I'm seeing, though, is that there's a real disconnect between the time that we're spending reading and theorizing and having deep conversations with the actions that we're actually doing on the ground. And so when I was reading about Julian Bond's work and kind of the tension that he held in the 1970s as the Black Power movement and the more radical left was rising, I thought that it was interesting as he talked about the Black ivory tower and the academics and the people who are talking about the work and the disconnect between the people who are doing it. And I also thought about how just yesterday we learned that there would be a Biden-Harris ticket, and thinking about how I immediately went on Twitter just to see what the conversation was like. And quickly the narrative became, we should not be trying to tear down a Black woman. We should be excited about this moment. And then there was the other side of the people that I follow on Twitter who were very upset about Joe Biden's vice president pick. And so for me, I tweeted that I was holding space for the complexity, understanding that there would be Black women who are celebrating this moment because it is monumental for Black women, for so many Black women. And then there will be the emotions of wanting to critique the establishment and wanting to ask for more. And so I think in the context of this time, it's so important that we understand that our collective politics extend beyond just electoral practices, but also our politics are what offer us a framework from which we can do our organizing and activism work. So when I'm thinking about what it means to be a socialist, when I'm thinking about what it means to be an academic, when I'm thinking about what it means to be a womanist, we have to use that framework as a way to help us do the actual work. And so just thinking about the work of Julian Bond to center Black women intentionally really makes me think about the more contemporary praxis that's existing right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Movement for Black Lives platform. And so I'm encouraged as a student to not just do the work on ground. Yes, we should be taking over the dean's office. Yes, we should be holding our universities and our institutions accountable for the things that they do. But we also have to look at the bigger picture and see that, for example, the University of Virginia is one of the biggest employers of people, Black and brown low-wage workers here in the Charlottesville community. And so when UVA is getting it wrong, that means that so many lives are on the line. And so understanding that while I am a Charlottesville resident and I'm from here, but I'm also a UVA student, it gives me this very unique opportunity to carry that activism on in the classroom and on grounds as we continue to try to get buildings renamed so that eugenicists don't have buildings on grounds, or so that we continue to try to get departments such as, the Woodson Institute endowed, and so that we continue to ask that the university pays people a living wage, but also so that we understand that the university has to do a better job of being a good neighbor to the Charlottesville community. And that's not just about pay, that's also about how we're interacting within space and how we're sharing space. And so I think that Julian Bond is just such a great example for me to look up to when I'm thinking about how I'm going to hold space for those different conflicts and tensions, and how I'm also going to continue to do the work that I do, even when people of older generations are, heavily critiquing the work and offering their pessimism and saying that they don't think that it's going to work. So thank you for the space.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank all of you. I'm gonna have, because we didn't start exactly on time, so if you want to stay and can stay on for, say, another 15 minutes, I'd like to invite the audience to post questions that they may have so that they can get responses from you. Katie, James, do you see any questions?
Not at the moment. I don't see any in the chat box.
Okay.
But
Well,
if anyone has a question, they can unmute themselves, or they can enter it straight into the chat box if you'd like.
Okay. Okay. Maybe here's something in the chat. Let's see what's here. Oh, no question. Just applause for Ziana. Okay. All right. Well, I'll start us off with a question. And I had put this question to the panelists, didn't print it out. I'm going to read from my phone, excuse me. While Bond often addressed himself to presidential campaigns and elections, he spoke equally often about the importance of down ballot races. Based on what you know about his politics, how do you think he would react to the current presidential campaign, the Biden-Harris ticket, and all of the huge investment people are placing in that ticket, as that ticket is going to represent, assuming they are elected, some radical transformation? Again, I often object when people say, well, so-and-so wouldn't have said, or so-and-so wouldn't have approved, but I'm really asking us, based on what we know about Julian Bond and our familiarity with, how might, imagine that a journalist is putting that question to them at this moment. What do you imagine his response would be?
Can I ask a question that follows up on that?
Yes.
So, and I think it's also,
I'm sorry?
I'm asking a question that follows that's also about the Biden-Harris, but it's also about the questions around Blackness and who has monopoly of Blackness, given the fact that, you know, Harris's Blackness is being questioned, right? In this particular in this particular political moment, that there are various questions surrounding whether Harris is Black enough, right? So I would be interested in hearing what the panelists have to say, that what would Julian Bond, who had his feet, if you will, both in the US and in continental Africa and in places like the Caribbean, if you will, what would Julian Bond, whose father was actually very active in the Pan-African circuit, right? He trained a lot of Pan-Africanists. So I'm particularly interested in what Julian Bond would have said about this, you know, questioning of Harris's Blackness, and what the panelists would have to say to that.
The panelists have suddenly become reticent.
I wanted to give the young people the floor first, because y'all know I can talk all day. So I think Rebecca has her mute.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, to give a short answer, I think he would tell us to focus on the policies. Because I have seen a lot of conversations around that. But that does seem secondary to, you know, what would this person actually do if they're in office? You know, people had the same conversations around Obama. He wasn't Black enough, you know, he was very, you know, but I think at the end of the day, we have to be strategic, and we have to have our eyes on the prize and, you know, focus on the policies.
Okay.
And I would add that yes, we should focus on the policies, but I also would question whether people are then viewing Blackness as a monolithic type of thing, if they are wondering how Black she is or if she's Black enough. And I think that that's often the part that gets muddled in electoral politics, and especially on the presidential stage. And so when we're thinking about how, like, Kamala Harris went to an HBCU, and people are now talking about what does that mean for HBCU students, and what does that mean for people who attended Howard. And even the videos that go around often of her marching with the marching band as a part of her earlier campaign events. And so wondering what is the qualifier for Blackness? And when attending a place like UVA, I think that's a conversation that we have often. So I do think, just like Rebecca said, that Julian Bond would tell us to focus on the policies, but he would also say that we are and we should be focused on holding her accountable, and being just as critical as we would with any other presidential candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, looks like we have someone here. In the first speech read this morning, I pick up this sentence: how to sell out, wait, where did it go? How to sell out to the South without once saying nigger. Today, we can similarly ask how to talk about the human conditions in reference to some specific US citizen categories without saying Black people, brown people, minority. Tasha, I know you have a response to that question.
I don't know why, you know I do. I'm looking at it, I'm trying to, how to talk about the human conditions in reference to some specific categories without saying.
I can also try to find that reference in that speech. I think I remember it, so I can look back.
Okay, one thing that I was thinking about, just in terms of the some of the sentences that you find throughout his writings, the other point I wanted to make was that he was so skillful and masterful at playing the dozens. He was a wordsmith in a way, you know? And so his insults are so incisive in the way he puts things and word things. And I figured that was probably from him being skillful and playing the dozens in a way. And so it's funny, just that particular sentence, how do you sell out the South without once saying nigger? I can imagine some of the things that probably followed, just kind of like a setup for playing the dozens in a way. But I think it seems to me that, and I don't quite understand the question. What comes to mind to me though, is this broadening of civil rights. And, you know, so much focus has been on a civil rights movement and focused on legislation, you know, or just the policies. Whereas so many of those activists and folks who were, you know, critical to the civil rights movement have moved towards a human rights framework. We often might talk about it in relation to Malcolm X, who was pushing that these are about human rights, not just about civil rights. And this is about the workings of racial capitalism. You know, these things are twin evils, racism and capitalism. So it's not just about race. And so I think Julian Bond definitely, over the course of his entire life, you know, even just in recent times, have been really thinking about a human rights frame. This is why even some aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement have kept trying to go to the UN, you know, to the United Nations in order to charge the US for human rights violations, you know, so that we could be held accountable on a global scale, and not just about civil rights, which makes the issue a domestic issue that doesn't require international intervention.
Right.
And so I think he's been very explicit in that way, but I don't necessarily see him as downplaying categories. I think that he was able to do both and speak to the specific conditions that Black people face, particularly poor Black people, or speak to the specific conditions that queer folks face, that women face. Like, he never ran from those categories. So I don't know the context of the rest of the speech, but to me, he was able to do both. They don't have to cancel each other out.
No, absolutely not. Okay. Any other questions? My computer is doing weird things here. Okay.
One thing that I did wonder about, and maybe the young people can help us think about this, is what was interesting to me in watching Dream Defenders, for instance, is that they actually did, canvassing and building people-to-people ties in a digital moment, And so once Black Lives Matter blew up, they ended up taking a social media hiatus, a social media blackout, recognizing that they got caught up in the followers and the likes, and that even their relationships with each other were disrupted and started to deteriorate. So they got off of social media to say, well, it's time for us to get back to grassroots organizing, to get back to building relationships with each other and with people. And I wonder, in this moment where you can just have 1 million followers on Twitter and people will say you're a civil rights activist, and there's no requirement to actually do organizing or actually engage with people where they are in their communities. And so I wonder what are your thoughts on that? Of course, technology, we can use it as a tool in ways that we couldn't before, but it reminds me of the work that, Julian Bond was doing with his campaign in that particular context of actually talking to ordinary people and getting their ideas, that you won't be able to do that necessarily with social media today in the same way. And also just thinking about the legacy of Ella Baker around the spade, what she was calling spade work, that slow work of organizing that has to happen, that we just can't do online. Like, so, you share a link or you share an article or you share a petition or sign one. To what extent do you think that young people might expand how they engage each other beyond social media?
I think it's interesting that you made the point about having 1 million followers and being called an activist, because I think that takes away the value of actual impact. And so I think we're right now living through a time where everyone is also a social impact guru. And I think that there is power in having people build trust through relationships before actually getting to the work. And I was actually having a conversation with some organizers earlier today. We were reflecting on the Reclaim the Park event that we held in Market Street Park yesterday in downtown Charlottesville to commemorate the third year August 12th attacks anniversary. And I made the point that a lot of people will come to these events without even knowing what it's about because they trust the individuals who are leading it. And so I think that trust goes beyond any amount of followers. It goes beyond any social media campaign that you can create, because people know that you'll deliver through on what you say that you're going to do. And I don't think that trust is not something you can always build online. But we're also in a time where youth activists are constantly being platformed and featured on bigger social media platforms. And so I even had the opportunity over the past couple of weeks to take over celebrities' Instagram accounts and gain quite a few followers. And people want to have very deep and personal conversations on the timeline. And I'm like, that is not the place for this. So I remember also listening to Angela Davis when she came to Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And she said there's a difference between mobilizing and organizing. And so I think it's important that we recognize that difference, because there's a time for marching in the streets, but there's also a time to do the background strategy work that has to be done in order for these movements to actually be sustainable. So I think that the work has to go offline in order to make pipelines, to make infrastructures that will last beyond individuals.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I agree wholeheartedly that there's a huge difference between mobilizing and organizing. And oftentimes we miss people if we're not willing to go out and have those conversations or engage people in a different way. And often we write people off, people will write these think pieces about why certain demographics may not vote or may not do certain things that we think they should do, but oftentimes they don't ask them why. and a lot of times the answer is as simple as, they don't feel like they're being represented or their issues are being taken seriously, or even that no one has ever engaged with them. So certainly now during the COVID crisis is harder, but I do believe that if we want to reach people, we have to be willing to engage deeper than social media.
We received a question on the YouTube stream.
Good.
And this was following up on Professor Otu's question about sort of notions of Blackness and colorism. And the person asking the question, Jillian, was asking if Bond was Bond ever challenged on his own notions of Blackness? And specifically, if Bond himself ever wrote about colorism and its capacity to divide, or if it came up for him personally throughout his career.
So because I want to say this because I feel, you know, the whole, is it the between John Lewis and Julian Bond, right? And I know that this is something we want to overlook, but or we've forgotten, but you know, there was this also issue of colorism, right? In terms of their own political ambitions and whatnot, and privilege and class and everything, right? So it looks like for me as someone who comes from Ghana, right, when I observe the political scene in the US, which is so racially charged, right, even within minorities such as the Black community, it's quite fascinating because my familiarity with Julian Bond, or the little I know of his work, right, is often the kind of work that is compelling us to move away from the center, right? Move from the center to the periphery to imagine other worlds, right? But very often what we see in contemporary Black politics and politics writ large is this, you know, desire to attach ourselves to whiteness, to attach ourselves to maleness, to attach ourselves to heterosexual, you know, this hegemonic identifications. So my point is that how is Julian Bond's work, or how does his experience, how does that experience allow us to distill whatever we are witnessing in this particular historical moment? Because colorism is still a big thing. And I really remember or recall the stories between, you know, Julian and John Lewis, both of whom had come forward to contest, you know, the same seat in Georgia, right? That, I mean, it looks like it's the same old thing again we are witnessing in the contemporary moment.
Can I jump in?
Michael, yes, I thought I was going to say, I thought I saw your, go ahead, please do.
Oh, well, thank you for the question, but I've got to dispel some of the mythology around the race between John and my father. And also, I'll give you a personal perspective of how color kind of affected him during the movement. And I'll just point out, if you look at the activists who are lighter skinned, they usually have the larger afros. If you go back and look at photos, because they were conscious that some of the old stereotypes within the African-American community, you know, some of the bad lessons that have been handed down by the slave master to divide us based on the hue and color of our skin, did permeate or could permeate the civil rights movement and endanger the movement. There was a compulsion to make sure that people articulated their authentic Blackness, that they were in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in the movement for the achievement of all, and did not want the perception of lighter skin, darker skinned, or whatever to come into the mix to jeopardize their movement. I mean, to piggyback on what was said about Kamala Harris, I mean, that's all that is. It is a paper tiger, a shadow attack at dividing people of color to find an excuse not to support her. I mean, they did it to a lesser degree with Obama. So in some instances, it may even be sexist that she's facing these types of attacks to try to divide people of color away from, to try to provide another excuse not to support her. Back to the race with John and my father, people forget that John Lewis and Julian Bond were considered in the early 60s the civil rights twins. They were best friends. They met at the formation of SNCC in 1960, and they were best friends ever since. John Lewis is my godfather, okay? And they were politically identical. They had the exact same stances on almost every issue. And the color of their skin really had no effect on the outcome of the election. People forget that this was John Lewis's, the 86 campaign was John Lewis's second attempt to try to gain that seat. He ran against then City Council President White Fowler, was a white man, a Democrat, and John lost. And my father was his campaign manager. That's how close they were. John lost that race. And so they had an agreement. They both had the same dreams. They both had the same political philosophy. And they had similar goals. They both wanted to go to Congress. And so they had an agreement that John would run first in the 70s, as he did. My father was his campaign manager. And the next time my father would run. Well, you know, that agreement was not kept. And so they both ended up in that same race. And so when you talk about the politics of color, the African-American community supported my father overwhelmingly in that race. It was the white vote in the runoff that John Lewis dominated, and that's how he won the seat. And so the dynamic, you would think that if you're going to believe that the more European-looking candidate would get the votes of those who are of European historical descent. And, you know, that didn't happen. The African-American community was solidly behind my father. The white community, Jewish community was behind John Lewis. And that's how he won the seat. And so we have to dispel this notion. You know, we talk about how white people can help us dispel racism against Blacks. We say, you know, between you, white people, between your counterparts, your friends, your groups, your Rotary Club, your sorority, fraternity, whatever organization you're a part of, whatever group you're a part of, when you're faced with racism, whether it's in a massive group or it's one-on-one, you've got to challenge it. And so we as African Americans have to do the same thing within the context of our own families, within our own groups, when it comes to colorism. We have to combat it. We are a beautiful diaspora of people that have wrongfully and rightfully been infused with the blood of other brothers from Europe and other places, but we stand together culturally as African Americans. And so we have to share that love, and we have to make that acknowledgement that Black is beautiful, all Black is beautiful. And we have to reinforce that with one another. I hope that answered the question.
Can I just offer maybe a more controversial point on this? I think that, you know, race and colorism also changes over time. It's not a fixed category. So even during that time, you know, yeah, you can look like Julian Bond or Diane Nash, and people are gonna say you Black still, because you have this experience in terms of understanding Blackness is not just about skin color or biological, but that we're talking about a power relation. And so, you know, I think that he would probably say that all of this conversation about Kamala Harris, well, we're calling her Kamala, but it's Kamala, you know, and so that's also an indication in terms of some distinctions as far as what she may identify as. But he would say it was a distraction because it's really about the politics. And this is why I have mentioned the issue of representation. So you can have someone Black, you know, Clarence Thomas is Black, you know, so you can have someone who's Black and celebrate the first Black person, the first Black woman, or what have you, and get distracted from the politics. But I don't think it's an illegitimate conversation to have about the fact that both Barack Obama and Kamala Harris have a ethnic mixture in their background, and that has been elevated to the position of president and vice president. And so we're not there yet in terms of someone having a mother who is Black. I wonder if that would make a difference. And I don't think it's about questioning their Blackness at all. I think it's a conversation about how white people perceive us. And so, unfortunately, white people sometimes think that a special kind of Black is different from us regular Black. So you might be a special kind of Black if your mother is white and you were raised by white people and had white grandparents and didn't have a connection to your Black family. That doesn't mean that you're not Black to us. Even Barack Obama said that Michelle taught him how to be Black. Kamala Harris had to, made some type of choices. And of course, Jamaican is real Black. That's what I'm saying. But her mama, also maybe made the intentional decision to raise her daughters as young Black women with confidence and without shame and so on. But that has, the irony about all of this is that Biden was the one who said that African Americans do not have a difference of opinion and attitudes like the Latino community. But he chose that vice president based on the idea that she has a special kind of Blackness, perhaps in their mind, that could maybe be more palatable to non-Black voters, or maybe more palatable to white male voters in terms of who she's coupled with. So I think there's a lot of complexity going on here that, of course, we embrace or question. I mean, it's really complex. If she was to just identify as Indian, people would be like, she Black, she got Black in her, or if, someone who doesn't identify with the Black side, we'd be so pressed, oh, they Black, look at them, And so it's, but I think there's a there in terms of the president and the vice president being able to be elevated into those positions with this special kind of Black ethnic background that is perceived to be more palatable. So in her case with immigration, what do we say about Black immigrants? They're more educated, they're thrifty, they believe in education more than our regular African Americans. And so she has this maybe merit that might be attached to her unfairly to distinguish her from your regular Black American, you know what I'm saying? And all of that is problematic. All of it is problematic. But I think, if anything, it contradicts Biden's statement, who tried to throw Black people under the bus, and his appeals to Latinx people to say that African Americans are all the same. No, we're not. There are some ethnic differences, even with the past census we're going to have to see, that created a category so that Black people, what kind of Black are you? Are you from the continent? Are you from the Caribbean Black? Those things are going to play out. And of course, these are always issues that we've had. And what I've learned from Bond, and I think Dr. O2 pointed this out in terms of just that Pan-Africanism. I mean, you have pointed out too, McDowell, that he talked about Black Africans and Black Americans have the same enemy, and so having that, we celebrate this with someone like Malcolm X, but I think Julian Bond has so much to teach us about the history of racism and colonialism. Indeed. That has impacted the entire world, and therefore we need to band together to fight those structures, regardless of what people's ethnic background is. And so I think he would say this is a distraction. He might laugh at it even, but I agree that it's a way to kind of tear her down in ways that's not productive at all. But I also think that there is something there about what kind of Black has been elevated into those positions, because there's also light skin privilege. And so for someone like Kamala to be a Black light skinned girl on Howard's campus, she was the stuff. And so was Julian Bond. So anyway.
I tell you, it never fails that when the question of colorism is introduced into the conversation, it gets animated. And I am not wanting to shut it down, except that we are near the end. In fact, we've gone over the allotted time. I had promised people that we would have an hour-long panel, mainly because we've been in harness all day. But I will give anyone in the Zoom room or on YouTube who have one final question before we close. Anyone with a burning question, a burning comment? Okay. This has been a wonderful day in many, many ways. I'm very glad that we got the opportunity to be together. It's been an intimate group of people, but I think it's been wonderfully stimulating to be in conversation and to be able to read Bond's work. When we began this project, I'll say in closing, we always talked about Julian Bond Papers Project as hoping to structure, to organize, to make available to people the breadth of Julian Bond's writings, his social commitments, his political commitments. And we have often talked about the pillars of his career, his unwavering commitments over the 50 plus years of his career to economic opportunity, to employment opportunity, to health and well-being, against police brutality, against pollution, that near the end of his life, one of his speeches is in opposition to the Keystone Pipeline. Again, is an indication of broad his interests were, admitted he was organizing around them. We are fortunate to have had him as a colleague here for a number of years. I still miss him greatly. And as Latasha pointed out earlier, he was hilarious. That's clearly one of my fondest memories of Julian, is sitting with him, talking about music and listening to his corny jokes. It's fortunate for us that we have historians who remain committed to keeping his work alive well and to understanding the civil rights and social justice movements in ever more nuance. I mentioned after reading one of the speeches this morning, which concern the speeches called New Directions for Civil Rights. And what Julian Bond is interested in that speech is in how the rights movement is understood, what narratives we have built around it, what those narratives include and exclude. I made this point much earlier in between readings, but I'll close with it here. So he was as much interested as being in the streets and the byways and the dusty roads and finding out from the people what they wanted, what they needed, right? Because he knew they could best articulate their interests. But he was also interested in scholarship, and he was interested in having this movement be understood as it needed to be understood. And again, what he wanted to emphasize there, not the celebrity activists, not the people who commanded the platforms, the airwaves, who were always the spokespersons, but those people whose names will likely never be known. But he challenged, in that time he gave that speech, which was importantly given right here at the University of Virginia, he was insisting on the importance of not erasing from the narratives of the civil rights movement ordinary people who, in his words, did ordinary people who did extraordinary things. All right. I want to thank everybody. I want to wish you a wonderful evening, all the people who read. I want to give an extra special thanks to James Perla and Katie Blizzard because of the technical apparatus behind the scenes, mounting speeches, putting out presses. That is all James and Katie. Erica Kavanaugh is no longer here, who should also be mentioned. Debbie Best and Randy Swift and our staff, none done without this. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.